72 hours. That's how far behind the Australians were told they were. Not in time zones, not in operational planning. In the jungle itself, a 4-man British SAS patrol had been living, breathing, and moving through the same stretch of primary Malayan rainforest 3 full days before the Australian observers even landed at the forward base. By the time the Australians pulled on their kit and stepped into the tree line, the British were already 3 days deep. No resupply, no radio contact, no trail markers, no visible trace. They had simply vanished into the jungle, as though the jungle had swallowed them whole. The Australian officer who received that briefing would later describe it as the single most disorienting professional moment of his career. Not because the British had better weapons, not because they had more men or more aircraft or a bigger budget, because they had disappeared into terrain that military planners in Canberra had assessed as requiring platoon-strength elements and substantial logistical support. And they had done it with 4 men, a fortnight of rations, and a compass. And they had done it so quietly that no one, not the enemy, not the forward operating base, not the birds in the canopy overhead, appeared to know they were there at all. What happened in the jungles of Malaya between 1950 and 1958 is a story that was classified for decades and remains, even now, imperfectly understood outside the special operations community. It is the story of how a regiment that had been formally disbanded, stripped of its budget, and dismissed by the conventional military establishment as a wartime irrelevance, rebuilt itself from nothing in one of the most hostile operating environments on Earth. It is the story of techniques, patient, unglamorous, physically brutal techniques that would define counterinsurgency warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. And it is the story of how a small force of British soldiers operating with methods that looked to outsiders like sheer recklessness did something that 40,000 conventional troops, artillery batteries, RAF bomber squadrons, and the full logistical apparatus of the British Empire could not do alone. They won. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, raised in 1957 at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne on the outskirts of Perth, asked for that debrief not out of courtesy. They asked because what they had seen in the Malayan jungle had convinced them that they were looking at a form of warfare they did not yet understand and urgently needed to learn. That request, and the knowledge that flowed from it, shaped the SASR into the force it became, which means that what happened in those jungles didn't just matter to the SAS. It mattered to every Commonwealth Special Forces unit that came after. This is where it started. This is where the 4-man patrol became doctrine. The Malayan Emergency was not supposed to last 12 years. When the first communist guerrillas of the Malayan National Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party, began attacking rubber plantations, derailing trains, and executing plantation managers in June 1948, the British colonial administration treated it as a policing problem. The word emergency was chosen deliberately and carefully. Insurance policies didn't pay out for wars, and the tin and rubber industries that made Malaya one of the most economically valuable territories in the British Empire depended on those policies remaining valid. So it was an emergency, a large, expensive, increasingly bloody emergency, but an emergency nonetheless. The MNLA was not an army by conventional definition. At its peak, it numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 fighters, almost entirely drawn from the ethnic Chinese community that had settled across Malaya's rural fringe over the preceding century. These were men and women who had, in many cases, spent the Second World War fighting the Japanese occupation as members of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the same guerrilla network that had been trained, supplied, and organized with British assistance. They knew the jungle intimately. They had supply networks embedded in civilian communities. They had an ideology that gave them purpose, a command structure that had survived years of Japanese counterinsurgency, and something the British Army initially did not, the ability to disappear. The jungle they disappeared into was not the jungle of popular imagination. a dramatic green cathedral of light and color. Malayan primary jungle was a wall, a dim, suffocating, moisture-saturated wall of vegetation so dense that a man could stand 3 meters from another man and not see him. The canopy above locked out the sky. The undergrowth below locked in the heat. Rotting vegetation on the floor produced gases and fungi and insects in quantities that made every step an act of physical negotiation. Leeches dropped from leaves. Vines grabbed ankles. Rivers appeared without warning and flooded without notice. A well-equipped infantry patrol moving under these conditions might cover 5 kilometers in a full day's march. A man alone, carrying a full Bergen rucksack and navigating by compass through featureless primary forest, might cover considerably less. The British Army's initial response to this environment was predictable and entirely wrong. Large formations swept through jungle sectors. Battalions conducted cordon and search operations in patterns that the MNLA observed, predicted, and evaded with contemptuous ease. Aircraft bombed jungle clearings, artillery shelled ridgelines. None of it achieved lasting results because the fundamental problem was not firepower. It was intelligence. And intelligence in this terrain required something that no amount of aerial surveillance or signals interception could provide. It required men who could live in the jungle long enough to see what was actually happening inside it. By 1950, after 2 years of escalating violence and with the insurgency showing no signs of weakening, the Commander-in-Chief Far East, General Sir John Harding, reached for the one man in the British Army who might understand the problem. He called in Major Mike Calvert. Calvert was not an easy man. He had commanded the SAS Brigade in the closing stages of the Second World War and had served with the Chindits in Burma. Long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines that made the Malayan jungle look, by comparison, hospitable. He was physically tough to a degree that bordered on pathological, intellectually restless, and profoundly resistant to the conventional military wisdom of his era. He had watched the SAS be disbanded in 1945 over his strenuous objections and had spent the years since nursing a conviction that the British Army had made a catastrophic institutional error. Small teams of highly trained soldiers operating deep behind enemy lines had won battles in the western desert that entire armored divisions couldn't resolve. That principle didn't expire with the war. It waited. Harding gave Calvert an assignment that would have daunted a less unusual man. He told him to go and study the insurgency himself, determine what was needed to defeat it, and then come back with a plan. Calvert spent 6 months doing exactly that. He traveled approximately 1,500 miles across Malaya. He walked into jungle sectors. He talked to plantation managers and police officers and tribal elders. He sat with Malay tracking experts and absorbed what they knew about how men move through this particular terrain. He was building a picture not from briefing room maps and intelligence summaries, but from the ground itself. When he came back, his assessment was precise. The MNLA derived its strength from 3 sources: the impoverished rural Chinese population that provided food and shelter through a combination of genuine sympathy and coerced compliance; the Orang Asli, the indigenous aboriginal peoples who lived in the deep jungle and whose intimate knowledge of its pathways and resources the communists had learned to exploit; and the jungle itself, which provided impunity to any force capable of operating within it. To defeat the insurgency, you had to take all 3 away. You had to deny the MNLA its food supply, its indigenous support base, and, critically, its sanctuary. No conventional unit could do this. The jungle ate conventional units. What was needed, Calvert argued, was a force of small patrols, 4 men at the irreducible minimum, trained to live in the deep jungle for weeks or months at a time, not to sweep through it and come back out, to stay, to become, in a specific and deliberate sense, more at home in the jungle than the enemy was, to build the kind of knowledge of terrain, weather, movement patterns, and tribal relationships that could only be acquired by sustained, patient presence, not by periodic incursions. Permission was granted. In June 1950, Calvert began raising what he called the Malayan Scouts, a unit that would, within 2 years, be redesignated as 22 Special Air Service Regiment. The jungle the Malayan Scouts entered in 1950 and 1951 very nearly killed them. Not killed by the enemy, killed by the jungle itself, by disease, by navigation failures, and in one critical early phase, by their own lack of discipline and experience. The earliest operations were a mixed picture. Calvert had assembled a force of varying quality, some genuine veterans of wartime special operations, some enthusiastic volunteers whose enthusiasm exceeded their training, and a cohort of soldiers from the Rhodesian Army who formed C Squadron and proved almost immediately to be among the most capable jungle operators in the regiment. Patrols went out for extended periods, carrying Bergen rucksacks that weighed in excess of 30 kilograms, loaded with weapons, rations, communications equipment, medical supplies, and the dozens of small items that sustained life in an environment that offered nothing useful. In the early phase, patrols lasted up to 14 days before resupply. Some operations pushed considerably further. One patrol under the legendary Johnny Cooper, an SAS original who had served with David Sterling in the Western Desert, lasted 122 days in the jungle, establishing a new forward base that would eventually become known as Fort Brooke. That figure, 122 days, was not a record for endurance's own sake. It was what the mission required. In the Malayan jungle, you didn't stop when you wanted to. You stopped when you had finished or when the jungle finished you. The four-man patrol as an operational unit evolved from hard experience rather than doctrine. It was discovered, not invented. 2 men could carry a wounded comrade. 4 men could provide security in all 4 cardinal directions simultaneously. 1 man watching forward, 1 watching the rear, 1 covering left, 1 covering right, while still maintaining the kind of minimal footprint that allowed movement through primary jungle without being heard or detected. More than 4 men, and the noise increased exponentially. The jungle floor, an accumulated mass of decaying leaf litter, rotting wood, and unstable root systems, amplified footsteps. Larger groups disturbed vegetation. The rustle of equipment against leaves became audible at distances that would surprise any soldier trained in European woodland. 4 men, moving with the right technique at the right pace, could reduce that signature to near nothing. The movement technique itself was agonizing by the standards of conventional infantry training. Point man first, testing the ground with each step. Heel down, roll to the toe, pause, listen. Weight transferred slowly, deliberately. Eyes not on the ground, but ahead and to the sides, reading the jungle for the signs that distinguished inhabited terrain from uninhabited. Bent vegetation, flattened undergrowth, wood shavings from where a machete had cleared a path, ash deposits from cold fires, the slightly different coloration of disturbed leaf litter on a regularly used trail. In the deep jungle, these signs were everything. The MNLA were professionals. They didn't leave obvious markers. But they couldn't be in the jungle without being in the jungle, and the jungle remembered everything that passed through it for days. Tracking became one of the SAS's foundational skills in Malaya, and its development drew on sources that no military doctrine manual could have anticipated. Several Iban trackers from Borneo, men from a society that had been reading jungle terrain as a survival skill for generations, were recruited to work alongside the SAS. The knowledge transfer went both ways. The Iban taught the British to read what they were seeing. The British learned not just the specific signs, but the methodology. Total attention to the environment, the mental cataloging of every detail, the patience to stop and examine something that didn't look right even when the patrol was already hours behind schedule. The patience, above all. The Malayan jungle rewarded patience. It punished haste. Resupply came by air. RAF aircraft, Valetas, and from 1953 onward, helicopters would fly over predetermined drop zones marked by smoke grenades and release supply bundles. This system worked imperfectly. Drop zones were small clearings in vast unbroken canopy, and supply bundles frequently missed them entirely, ending up caught in the treetops 30 meters above the jungle floor. Patrols spent additional hours retrieving supplies from heights that required improvised climbing techniques. Every complication was absorbed, worked around, and added to the collective knowledge of what jungle operations actually required, as opposed to what planners expected them to require. Maps were another problem. Early mapping of Malayan interior was so imprecise that patrol commanders navigating by compass found regular discrepancies between what the map showed and what the terrain actually presented. They adapted by developing an extraordinary instinct for terrain, reading the slope of the ground, the pattern of drainage, the behavior of rivers, that supplemented the compass with a form of embodied landscape knowledge. Then came tree jumping, and it nearly destroyed the regiment before it found its stride. The logic was sound. A patrol that could be inserted by parachute directly into deep jungle, bypassing days of approach march through enemy-controlled terrain, was a patrol that arrived at the target area fresher, less exposed, and ahead of schedule. The technical problem was the canopy itself, which in primary Malayan jungle rose to heights of 50, 60, sometimes 70 meters. Standard parachute descent over open terrain meant nothing in a jungle that had no open terrain. Parachutists deployed over the jungle canopy landed in the treetops, and the question of what happened after that was not one that existing training had answered. The answer the SAS developed was characteristically direct: carry a rope and abseil down. Parachutists would jump carrying 100 feet of rope, allow their canopy to snag in the upper branches of a tree, then tie off the rope and lower themselves to the jungle floor. The technique worked in principle and failed catastrophically in practice. Malayan jungle trees grew to heights that 100 feet of rope couldn't bridge. Parachute canopies snagged unevenly, leaving jumpers suspended at extreme angles. The operation called Sword in January 1954 resulted in 3 SAS soldiers killed during a parachute insertion in Kedah when the descent went wrong. The regiment absorbed the lesson, increased rope lengths to 200 feet, refined the harness system, and continued. By July 1954, and Operation Termite, the largest combined air-ground operation of the emergency to that point, involving more than 50 aircraft including Lincoln bombers of the RAF and Royal Australian Air Force and 200 SAS paratroopers. The technique had improved to the point where injuries were described as negligible. The improvement was not accidental. It was the product of an institutional culture that treated every failure as data and every problem as something to be solved rather than reported up the chain. This culture had existed in the original SAS since David Stirling's L Detachment in the Western Desert, and it had survived the regiment's formal disbandment and unofficial resurrection with its essential character intact. The men who solved the tree-jumping problem weren't doing it because headquarters told them to. They were doing it because the mission required it, and in the SAS's understanding of its own function, the mission always required something. The hearts and minds strategy that became the defining concept of the Malayan Emergency was not invented by a committee of staff officers. It grew from the jungle floor upward, from the SAS patrols that were already doing it before anyone had named it. The Orang Asli, the various indigenous aboriginal peoples of Malayan interior, were the key to the jungle war in a way that no satellite, no signals intelligence platform, and no bombing campaign could have revealed. The MNLA understood this before the British did. The insurgents had established a network of Orang Asli informants and auxiliaries who provided food, early warning of security force movements, and safe haven in the deepest parts of the jungle. In some areas, this cooperation was voluntary, driven by genuine sympathy with the communist cause. In most areas it was coerced. MNLA cadres threatened violence against anyone who failed to provide what was demanded. The SAS response was to do what no conventional battalion could do: live with the Orang Asli. Not among them temporarily, not in adjacent fortified positions, but with them. 4-man SAS teams were deployed to Orang Asli settlements for periods of up to 3 months at a time, with orders to ingratiate themselves with the community, provide medical care, build relationships, and through that relationship, understand the pattern of MNLA activity in the surrounding jungle. The SAS medics, trained to a level that in civilian terms would have qualified them as paramedics, treated ailments that had gone untended for years. They ate what the Orang Asli ate. They slept where the Orang Asli slept. They learned enough of the relevant language, often through a combination of Malay as a shared medium and sheer patient repetition, to communicate meaningfully. This was not soft. These were men who had survived the regiment's selection and who carried weapons and knew how to use them. The gentleness was tactical. An Orang Asli community that trusted the SAS would provide intelligence. An Orang Asli community that had been threatened by the MNLA and then abandoned by security forces that came and went in armored convoys would provide nothing. The SAS stayed. That was the difference. And when a community began to provide intelligence, when a village elder mentioned that men with weapons had passed through heading northeast 2 nights before, when a hunter described a camp he'd seen while following game, that information entered the targeting cycle within days rather than weeks. The community building process was not universal success. In 1951, a trooper named O'Leary became separated from his patrol and was found dead, murdered by Orang Asli, whose loyalties in that particular area had not yet been won. The regiment noted this, absorbed it, and continued. The patience required to build trust in communities that had been exploited, threatened, and lied to by multiple parties over years could not be forced. It could only be demonstrated through consistent presence and consistent honesty. The SAS demonstrated both. By the mid-1950s, as the intelligence network built through these relationships began to mature, MNLA cadres in areas of sustained SAS presence found themselves in a deteriorating position. Food supply lines were drying up as Orang Asli communities redirected their cooperation. Movement routes through jungle areas previously considered safe were being watched by men who knew exactly what to look for. Cell leaders who had moved through the deep jungle with confidence for years found that confidence evaporating as the environment they had counted on for protection began to work against them. An average of 1,000 patrol hours was required to achieve a single contact with the enemy in the Malayan jungle. An ambush based on good intelligence rewarded every 350 hours. These numbers look discouraging until you understand what they represent: the slow, patient accumulation of presence, knowledge, and relationships that eventually made the jungle more dangerous for the MNLA than for the SAS. That transformation didn't happen because of air power or artillery. It happened because 4 men sat in a jungle village for 3 months and learned which trails led where. The Australians had been in Malaya since 1950. 3 Australian battalions deployed there as part of the British Commonwealth Far East Strategic Reserve, along with RAAF units that participated in operations, including the bombing runs of Operation Termite. Australian troops fought in the jungle, took casualties, and acquitted themselves well by any conventional infantry standard. They knew the environment, they knew the enemy. They believed, not unreasonably, that they had a workable understanding of what jungle counterinsurgency required. Then they watched the SAS work. The creation of Australia's first Special Air Service Company on 25 July 1957, formally based at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne on the edge of Perth, was a direct consequence of what Australian military planners had observed in Malaya. The logic was explicit and straightforward. The British SAS had demonstrated a form of capability in this environment that conventional forces could not replicate, and that the campaign against the MNLA had proven was not optional. If Australia intended to operate in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the geography of Australia's strategic neighborhood made this not a question of if, but of when, Australia needed that capability. It needed men who could do what the British had shown was possible. What the Australians had seen was not simply elite soldiers performing impressively. They had seen a different philosophy of warfare made operational at every level. The British SAS four-man patrol in Malaya operated with an autonomy that no conventional infantry unit was trained or equipped to exercise. The patrol commander made decisions about navigation, about pace, about whether to approach or withdraw from a suspected MNLA position, without reference to higher headquarters, because higher headquarters was days away by foot and potentially weeks away by radio in deep jungle where signal propagation was unreliable. The patrol operated under a standing mandate: patrol the assigned sector, gather intelligence, make contact with Orang Asli communities, report. And within that mandate made every tactical decision itself. This required a caliber of individual judgment that the British selection and training system was specifically designed to produce. Men who had survived the hills phase on the Brecon beacons, weeks of solo navigation through some of the most punishing terrain in the United Kingdom, carrying progressively heavier loads under conditions that ranged from freezing rain to near-zero visibility fog, had already demonstrated something essential before they ever reached Malaya. They had demonstrated that when everything external was removed, when there was no officer to ask, no established trail to follow, no support vehicle waiting at the next road junction, they could make correct decisions alone under sustained physical and psychological stress. That quality was not an option in the Malayan jungle. It was the price of admission. The Australians who watched a British SAS troop brief for an operation understood, at least conceptually, what they were seeing. What the debrief request reflected was a more specific question. How do you build that? How do you take a military culture shaped by the traditions of conventional warfare and produce men who can navigate 64 kilometers through featureless primary jungle on a compass bearing, maintain absolute noise discipline for 72 hours while living within 500 meters of an enemy camp, and make life-or-death tactical decisions without radio contact with anyone who outranks them? How do you select for patience, specifically, in a culture that tends to reward speed and aggression? How do you train men to be still? The answer, it turned out, involved accepting that the process was longer and the attrition higher than conventional military logic suggested was efficient. The SAS selection system did not try to produce all-round soldiers from average raw material. It identified, through an extended process of systematic elimination, the small proportion of candidates who already possessed the foundational qualities that could not be taught: the ability to continue functioning alone when every physical signal was telling the body to stop, the instinct to navigate accurately when landmarks disappeared and the map became an abstraction, the psychological stability to remain effective during extended periods of uncertainty, isolation, and monotony, broken by brief moments of extreme danger. Those qualities were sieved for, not manufactured. The tactics themselves had an internal logic that became visible only when you understood the environment they were designed for. The SAS in Malaya did not, in general, seek contact with the MNLA in the sense that conventional infantry sought contact as a prerequisite for bringing fire to bear and closing with the enemy. Contact in the deep jungle was an admission of failure. It meant someone had made noise, or moved too fast, or failed to read a sign that should have signaled a change in direction. The preferred outcome of a patrol was never a firefight. It was intelligence. Every trail intersection examined, every abandoned camp assessed, every Orang Asli conversation carefully recorded and transmitted. This was the patrol's primary product. The firefight, when it came, was a consequence of intelligence, not a replacement for it. An ambush triggered by information obtained from an Orang Asli source about a regular MNLA resupply route was not an expression of aggression. It was the end product of weeks of patient intelligence accumulation, delivered at a time and place of the SAS's choosing. The ambush itself, when executed by the SAS in Malaya, followed a pattern of controlled violence that bore little resemblance to the sustained firefights of conventional warfare. A patrol that had identified a MNLA trail and established through observation that it was regularly used would select an ambush position, move into it silently over a period of hours, and wait. The waiting could last a day. It could last 3 days. Patrols lay in their ambush positions in the jungle heat and humidity, insects exploring exposed skin, sweat soaking every layer of clothing, without moving beyond the absolute physiological minimum. Communication in position was by touch or prearranged hand signal. Sound discipline was total. When the MNLA walked into the killing ground, the engagement was brief and violent in proportion to the preparation that had preceded it. At ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, with weapons, typically the Owen submachine gun and Bren light machine gun in the early phase, later supplemented with the M1 carbine and the SLR, zeroed for close-range use in low light, the patrol opened fire simultaneously on a signal from the commander. The engagement was over in seconds. What followed was equally important: immediate exploitation of the ambush site, collection of documents, weapons, and any materials that could identify the unit and its network, followed by rapid extraction along a pre-planned route before MNLA, quick reaction forces, could respond. Every ambush was designed to produce intelligence for the next operation while denying the enemy the ability to learn from the experience. The cumulative effect of this methodology, applied consistently across the years of the emergency, was the progressive denial of the jungle interior to the MNLA. Not through occupation, the SAS never had enough men to occupy anything, but through saturation with knowledge. By the mid-1950s, there were sectors of Malayan jungle where MNLA commanders could not move a courier without the high probability that someone, somewhere in the patrol network, would eventually see the track and trigger a follow-up. The insurgents had built their confidence on the assumption that the deep jungle was theirs. That assumption was dismantled one four-man patrol at a time over a period of years at a cost in human endurance that the official records understate and the participants rarely discussed in public. The physical cost of sustained jungle operations was not incidental. It was integral to what the SAS became in Malaya. A man carrying a Bergen rucksack loaded to 30 kilograms in primary jungle at 30 degrees Celsius and 90% humidity was expending energy at a rate that peacetime ration scales didn't account for. Early patrols suffered severe weight loss. 6, 8, 12 kilograms over a 2-week deployment was not uncommon. Dehydration was a constant threat despite the surrounding humidity, because sweat loss in that environment was continuous and rivers were not always where the map suggested they should be. Foot problems, blisters, immersion, foot from constant moisture, the infected cuts that the leech bites and thorns produced if not treated immediately, degraded patrol effectiveness over time in ways that were cumulative rather than dramatic. Tropical diseases were a category of their own. Leptospirosis, transmitted through contact with water contaminated by animal urine, was endemic. Scrub typhus was transmitted by larval mites in certain vegetation types. Malaria persisted despite prophylactic medication. Fungi grew in skin folds and on feet with a persistence that modern medicine still finds instructive. SAS medical training in Malaya became, out of necessity, far more comprehensive than its equivalent in any other unit. Patrol commanders were expected to be capable of managing a range of tropical medical emergencies for days without evacuation, because evacuation from deep jungle was not a matter of calling a helicopter and waiting 20 minutes. A casualty in the deep jungle was a serious operational problem, and the skills required to manage that problem were built into every patrol member as standard. Psychological endurance is harder to document and easier to underestimate. A 4-man patrol 3 weeks into a 14-day scheduled deployment, 2 men carrying infections that should have seen them evacuated but couldn't be because the extraction window had passed, navigating by compass through terrain that didn't match the map, aware that the patrol behind them had failed to make contact and that nobody outside the jungle knew precisely where they were. This was the operational reality for which the Brecon Beacon selection had been a preparation, not a simulation of that reality. A genuine pretest of the individual's capacity to function when the supporting structures of normal military life had been completely withdrawn. Men failed in the jungle who had passed everything the selection process required. The SAS accepted this. It wasn't a failure of the selection system. It was the system working as designed. Selection identified candidates who were most likely to succeed. It couldn't guarantee success in every combination of environment, mission, and circumstance. What it could guarantee was that every man who wore the badge had demonstrated a specific category of self-reliance that made the 4-man patrol viable as an operational unit. Remove that baseline, and the entire methodology collapsed. By 1957, the year the first SAS company was formally raised in Perth, the Malayan Emergency was winding toward its conclusion. The MNLA's numbers had fallen from a peak of around 8,000 to approximately 2,000, and those remaining had been pushed into shrinking pockets of jungle in the northern states bordering Thailand. The Hearts and Minds campaign had succeeded in separating the bulk of the rural Chinese population from the insurgency. The Orang Asli communities that the SAS had cultivated over years of patient relationship building had shifted their allegiance definitively, denying the MNLA the deep jungle sanctuary it depended on. By 1960, the emergency was formally declared over. The British SAS emerged from Malaya not just with a reputation, but with something more durable: a doctrine. Approved, tested, iteratively refined set of methods for how small teams of supremely capable individuals could operate in denied terrain for extended periods and achieve effects utterly disproportionate to their numbers. The 4-man patrol, the extended presence over contact, the intelligence-led ambush, the relationship building with indigenous populations as an intelligence platform, the compression of planning cycles, and the autonomy of the patrol commander. All of these had been born or refined in the Malayan jungle, paid for in weight loss and jungle rot and the occasional irretrievable tragedy, and validated by the outcome of the campaign itself. When the newly formed first SAS company in Perth requested the debrief, a formal knowledge transfer from the British regiment about what had actually worked in Malaya, they were not being polite. They were being intelligent. They understood that they were inheriting not a set of equipment tables and an organizational chart, but an entire philosophy of special operations, one that had been paid for in full and was being offered through the bonds of Commonwealth military relationship without reservation. The SASR adopted the sandy beret and the motto, "Who dares wins." It adopted the 4-man patrol as its fundamental tactical unit. It adopted the selection philosophy, the brutal sifting for self-reliance over strength, for judgment over speed, for the capacity to endure over the capacity to impress, that Calvert had embedded in the regiment from its first days in Malaya. It adopted the patient intelligence-first approach to special reconnaissance that the SAS had developed through 103-day patrols and pre-dawn ambushes and 3-month stays in Orang Asli villages. And it went on to apply those methods in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, proving each time that the principles the British SAS had forged in the Malayan jungle did not expire when the jungle did. They translated, they scaled, they worked against every enemy in every terrain because they were rooted not in a specific technology or a specific environment, but in the specific human capacity that the selection process identified and the training system developed. The British officer who told the Australian observers that they were 3 days behind was not being dismissive. He was explaining something precise and operational. A patrol had inserted into an assigned sector 72 hours before their arrival, and the intelligence it was generating would inform operations the Australians were about to participate in. The 3 days was information. What the Australian officer heard beneath the operational briefing was something else. That this was what it looked like to be fully inside the jungle rather than moving through it. That 3 days was the gap between an army that operated in the jungle and an army that the jungle had accepted. Closing that gap took the Australian SASR years of selective recruitment, brutal selection, and the patient absorption of the British regiment's accumulated institutional knowledge. They earned it through the Borneo confrontation, through the jungles of South Vietnam's Phuoc Tuy province, through deployments that replicated the Malayan methodology in different latitudes. By the time the SASR stood alongside the British SAS in Afghanistan half a century later, the two units were peers, different in character, identical in the foundational principle that the individual operator, selected for specific qualities and trained beyond any conventional military standard, was the decisive instrument in the category of operations that conventional forces couldn't reach. The Malayan Emergency produced no famous battles. There were no lines on a map that shifted decisively, no single engagement that broke the enemy's will. What it produced was a template for patient warfare, for intelligence-driven operations, for the relationship between special forces and indigenous populations, for the autonomy of the small team in denied terrain. That every counterinsurgency campaign conducted by Western forces in the following 7 decades drew from consciously or otherwise. It also produced a generation of SAS operators who returned from Malaya to Stirling Lines in Hereford, carrying something that couldn't be measured on any fitness assessment or scored on any skills test. They carried the knowledge of what it felt like to be 3 days deep in primary jungle, completely alone, completely responsible, with the mission still ahead of them and nobody coming to help if things went wrong. That knowledge is not a credential. It is a transformation. And it is the transformation that Mike Calvert set out to produce when he walked into the Malayan jungle alone to study the problem, and the transformation that 4-man SAS patrols produced in themselves, day after day, kilometer after kilometer, over 8 years of operations in terrain that the conventional military establishment insisted was unsuitable for small units operating without substantial support. The conventional military establishment was wrong. The jungle was exactly where small units belonged, and the men who proved it, moving silently through the canopy and the root systems and the chemical-stinking rivers, did it with a burgan on their backs, a compass in their hand, and enough time ahead of anyone else's timetable to be 3 days gone before anyone arrived to look for them. 3 days behind. The Australians took that lesson home to Perth. They've been catching up ever since.